everybody, and a very warm welcome to our very first episode of our new series of Leaders for Humanity. And as part of a larger program, which we will explain very shortly to you, which is called Good Organizations, we are trying to introduce to you, but also have dialogues with a number of what we find very important and very wise people who can help us in trying to better understand what is going on in the world today and how potentially all of us in our organizations in particular could contribute in making a small difference to helping to make the world a little better. So with that, I would also like to introduce my co-host Antoinette and Alicia Hennig, who's going to be our very first interviewee today. Alicia, welcome, and thank you so much for making time. I don't know how to say that in China. You will need to help me here in Chinese, but very, very nice to see you. Okay. I think you're on mute, Alicia.
Yeah, I was wondering whether I should say something already now, but yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm excited about this kind of interview.
Wonderful. And I mean, if we have, which could very well be the case, any listeners from an Eastern background, how would we say a very warm welcome to our listeners in Chinese? How would that sound?
I think I would keep it simple and just say 大家好. So it's like, well, welcome to the great family. Like, well, yeah, kind of something like that. But the normal greeting is always 大家好, and that means like big family, hello, like literally translated.
Wonderful. 大家好 to everybody who's coming in from that side of the world. And let me introduce you very briefly to the agenda for the interview today, or the dialogue rather. We will do a very first opening to get you into the position to understand the frame and the container for this conversation. Thereafter, we will, of course, introduce Alicia a little bit further, beyond the first kind of Chinese lesson. And I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about Chinese and Eastern philosophy on this webcast. And then we will go into really the gist of the conversation. And today's topic is virtue ethics in business. So we will particularly look at neo-Aristotelian thought and morality, but with a clear focus on organizations and organizational leaders. So the slightly provocative title for the session today is, do we need philosopher CEOs? A little bit like Plato in the old days suggested we need philosopher kings. So translated into a modern 21st century context, does that mean we need philosopher CEOs? And we will explore this, and hopefully you will come to a conclusion about this question by the end of the hour. And finally, we will just close down and wrap up with some of the key conclusions that amongst the three of us we found, and hopefully you will equally be in a better position to judge by yourself. A bigger project. Driving change in this complex world that we are all facing today feels very daunting. It's a big world and we are very small, and also very complex, very, very difficult. And therefore this project that we have created, which we've named Good Organizations, is really a desire and an attempt to create a community of people who are willing to spend their personal effort and time in holding some of the core questions that are important for today's world, and also to go from the questions and the theory and the research towards action. So in our belief, organizations can become a very important force for good, even in today's capitalistic society, so to speak, either by acting well in the ecology and ecosystem they find themselves in, or by creating a container for a flourishing collective within those organizations, or finally by creating a good breeding ground, a good fertile territory for the individuals that find themselves in the organizational system to attain whatever the good life means for them. And then in that attempt, we've launched a website, so please have a look at goodorganizations.com. But we've also created a number of different and targeted communities that we are trying to involve in this conversation. We are looking for free thinkers who can go beyond the current bubble, as Antoinette is always saying, in helping us with exploring some of the challenges and questions. We are involving researchers because very often there are lots of opinions, but very few kind of evidence-based theories. And we are trying to create a narrative that then we can propose to what we call this salons of humanity, where we're trying to unite academics, consultants, coaches, and organizational leaders together in trying to actually take some of the steps forward that come out of this dialogue. So hopefully you will hear a lot more about this in the coming months. And with that, let me hand over to the much more important part of this call today. And I will go and hand over to Antoinette to introduce our first interviewee, Alicia Hennig. Antoinette, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, Alicia, I'm really glad that we have a philosopher queen here rather than a philosopher CEO. And we have you here because we find that you are such an outspoken yet nuanced philosopher, currently holding an interim professorship in business ethics at the TU University in Dresden. But also very interestingly, in many other universities, you're also teaching, and you're also trying to teach business leaders in Eastern philosophy and what that could mean to them in stepping into other shoes, which we find really, really interesting. And by the way, we just written here, walk the talk, because what I personally find really great about you is you really spend so many years in that context. You really know what you're talking about. And I don't think there's so many people out there which can kind of master that. So welcome here, really great to have you here. And I would suggest that we start right away with personal questions. And the first thing I would like you to talk a little bit, because I know we always forget things when we introduce people, is how would you yourself describe yourself in a few attributes?
How would I describe myself? Yeah, that's always the most awkward question, I think, especially when not being prepared. So I think I would, well, if there are any attributes I would assign to myself, I think it's trying to be as open-minded as possible, looking at things from different perspectives and not just excluding right away certain perspectives. But yeah, that always requires constant training, because most of the times, you know, we want to stay in the comfort zone. We say like, yeah, but you know, that's not possible. So, and then lastly, yeah, I try to be optimistic, but I know I'm also a realist. So I think that's like always, you know, it's both things, but depending on the mood or the situation or the context, I'm perhaps more realistic than optimistic. But in any case, and you know, coming a bit more to like the virtue stuff, I still believe in that human beings are good beings, and you know, by giving them the opportunity to develop themselves further, I think yeah, we can make the most of it. And this outlook, I think, this positive outlook on the human being as such is very important. So yeah, that would be my description, like about myself, what I'm striving for, or yeah.
Very nice. A pragmatic idealist almost. And let me maybe go on a little bit about what that means for you. So we've heard a lot about this YOLO wave, this you only lead once after the pandemic, where people strongly feel that they need to make more out of their lives. So the good life is something that seems to resonate these days. And I'm just interested, with you having so much experience also across cultures and being a philosopher, what is the good life for you, and what does good work mean for you personally? And maybe through your career, what was most positive and most challenging in getting to that meaning in life and work?
I think well, the most positive lesson in retrospective, but also the hardest lesson, was becoming a hybrid. Like someone who can survive in both worlds, understanding the other, like kind of thinking paradigm, adjusting to it to some degree, but of course there are limits to adjustments because you still have your own identity and you want to carry on with your own identity. But I think that's like, that was the most valuable lesson over the past years. But speaking of what makes a life a good life, I think it's, well, I see it in my job mainly. I think, you know, when I have my students, the most important thing is to let them flourish, you know, let them discuss, reducing hierarchical barriers. So this is why they say "du" to me, you know, they don't use the doctor title or anything. They just call me Alicia, right? In like when we have seminars, I find this important because I see myself as a facilitator, as a mentor, and not as a teacher to lecture people what they should do or what they should not do, right? It needs to come intrinsically, you know, from their own kind of intellectual engagement. And I think the good life is about not imposing too much on others, but understanding their potential and promoting their potential without imposition of your own kind of agenda. I think that's something that makes a good life.
Well, it's just kind of, it's interesting that you said you had to become a hybrid, because that, of course, later will resonate what you're telling us about some of the Eastern philosophies, but it also resonates with some sociological work from Barbara Janiowska, for instance, and she was kind of going about, well, because I'm a hybrid everywhere, a foreign woman in another country, a woman with lots of men, it also gives me much more freedom, and I have to fill this freedom as well with trying to live the good life. Is this something that resonates with you, that some of the experiences you also had?
You mean in the sense of like having the responsibility to live up to a good life in that sense, or?
No, it's just because kind of you are expected to be strange anyhow. So you can kind of have the freedom of a fool. And I think it makes it almost a little bit more maybe challenging then to kind of find your own.
I think that's not exactly the case with China. There is the expectation that at one point you adapt. And if you don't adapt, you're a barbarian. You're like not a civilized person, you know? So it really, I mean, and the question is still today, if you play the foreigner card, right, and say like, you know, you think I'm stupid? Yes, I'm stupid, but I can still do what I want. Or you try to be as, you know, acculturated as possible, but then you may not win the game either, because, you know, you're just, I don't know, you're following their rules, but at the same time, you will not win the game because you're still not Chinese, right? So that's a fundamental question I've been also discussing with a colleague who has spent like equal amounts of time in China. And in the beginning, I tried to, you know, and that would be still my approach. We got to learn from this new environment, you know, already, because we ourselves perhaps are striving for getting the most of our experience, right? If I stay just within my foreigner bubble, I will not get the same experience if I leave my comfort zone and really do a deep dive, you know, into the culture. And so this is what I've been doing, because otherwise I wouldn't have been working for Chinese universities as one or two of all foreigners, you know, so I could have equally joined a joint university where there are more foreigners, you know, and there is more of a comfort zone. So I was not seeking this. I was deliberately seeking the lion cage, but of course that led to like quite tough experiences. But yeah, so lesson learned, you know. But yeah, so I think it always depends on in what kind of cultural environment you are. But as a woman in China, I wouldn't say you are really free. I mean, yes, as a foreigner, you still enjoy a little bit more of freedom, but at the same time, pressures to adapt are there. And you can see that, I mean, now with the rising nationalism, like the times that China is foreigner friendly are over. So either you adapt or you better leave the country. Yeah, but that's specifically on China. Like it could be different for other countries. And then perhaps you have a different degree of freedom.
Let me dive in here. Let me dive in here, because otherwise we won't get into the main discussion. But I think what I'm hearing is, I think that these are some terms that will continue to provoke us during the rest of the interview. The relationship between individual and collective, culture, but also I think the notion of freedom. So is freedom individual, freedom of choice is always kind of put on a pedestal in a westernized world, or is freedom maybe also something else? I think that would be interesting. Closing out the kind of section about you, Alicia, can I ask you one more question, just with a kind of quick thought from you on, based on what you've seen, and you just mentioned that you have also suffered, I think, through that cultural divide. Is there one piece of advice that you're happy to share with people in terms of attaining their good life? What's the one thing that you would invite them to do?
I think whenever you're exposed to cultural differences, take your time and reflect on whether you really want to go for adaptation or it's too much for you and you cannot handle it, and you leave this environment without kind of accusing yourself of failing. I think that's very important, because oftentimes when we cannot cope with the foreign environment and we withdraw, we think we just failed, but I think the story is not so easy. So it's not directly related to the question of a good life, but I think in order to have a good life for yourself, I think you should not blame yourself too much if you cannot survive in a different culture.
Very nice. And I heard two things. One, don't blame yourself necessarily, there's also this notion of failure being a resource for learning. But I think the second thing I'm hearing is reflection. Take a step, pause, take a breath, and reflect on what's actually going on and what the cultural conditioning also means. Very nice, and thank you for that, for sharing a little bit about yourself. And with that, I will go back to the slide just for one more slide, which brings us to the main section. And in order to frame and create a container for the conversation that will follow now, I just want to introduce to our listeners briefly the structure of the inquiry that the Good Organization Project entails. And mainly our endeavor is to connect the individual or the leadership development with the organizational development with the societal development. And we are asking a question of what is a good organization in the context of all these three levels, as I mentioned earlier. And here are some of the key questions in each of the sections. And we will start with the what is good actually? What is a good business? What is a good society? What does it mean from a moral philosopher standpoint across East and West? That's where we will start, and probably we'll have a few interesting questions there. We will also try to bring in then the concept of positive psychology in this context and see what it resonates with Alicia. The second block will be about, that's all good. We understand what good is, or better understand what good could be. How do we operationalize that in today's typical organization, especially big corporates? And finally, what does it mean for leadership? And Alicia has written a PhD on the subject, so we are very curious to, at the end, get a few thoughts on this as well. So this is the structure for the next, I would say, probably half hour or a little bit more. So fasten your seatbelts and get into the dialogue. And I will, again, hand over to Antoinette to kick us off with the good business section. And please, the floor is yours for the first question.
Wonderful. So yes, we are in something which a lot of people find already difficult. It's about morality in business. And I would just want to ask you, what makes an ethical business?
Yeah, that's not an easy question, of course, what makes an ethical business. But in a nutshell, I think what makes a business an ethical business is people who have learned to think for themselves and act for themselves, who can come up with a proper judgment of the situation, and to have an inner compass of what is right and what is wrong, right? To have like some kind of internal guidance, speaking of Aristotle, speaking of Adam Smith, impartial spectator, for example, having a solid conscience, you know, I think that's what makes a good business eventually, when all these people are working, you know, on the same level of consciousness and understanding of what makes an action a good action. So just in a very general basis.
Coming in right there with, I think, so professors of business ethics. So Antoinette and I are, of course, not experts in business ethics, which is why we have got lots of philosophers on our list of interviews. But we have done our homework a little bit. And I don't know, Antoinette, how many essays have we read about business ethics? Probably almost 100 or so, I reckon. Right. So, and one thing that strikes me is that I found a large majority of business ethics textbooks positioning business ethics as a means to an end. So I've even seen flowcharts where business ethics, together with other resources, determines good profits. Right? And good profits, I mean maximum profits. Right? So there seems to be a notion that business ethics helps you to mitigate business risks and exposure in any regard, right? Especially in terms of reputational damage, or become something that you have to become an expert in terms of minimum standards and compliance, to just make sure that you do what you have to do, but not more. So let me ask you a very provocational question. So kind of business ethics, does that even exist? Is that an oxymoron? Because it doesn't seem to very, very closely relate to what you just said to Antoinette.
Oh, I think it exists. I mean, it also should exist, because actually we should not separate business from society. Business is a vital part of society, and this is why the same ethical rules we have in society should ideally also exist in business, because it's not that we change to completely different people only once we enter the organization, right? So, and I think there is a legitimate reason for the business ethics discipline to exist. And to ask these questions. But of course, within the business ethics discipline, which is not homogeneous, we have people taking a more strategic approach, right? So where it's about reconciling profits with like ethics and that kind of stuff. But we also have people who are more like argumenting from an intrinsical perspective, like what has it to do with the human being as such, and being a good human being in an organization and in a society. So I think it kind of boils down to what kind of ideology you're taking up within the business ethics discipline, right? It's not, I mean, and we can see like the business ethics discipline is constituted of like philosophers, but not so many actually, and mostly people from economics. So I guess you can do the math and think about what's the more common approach in business ethics, and that's perhaps the more strategic approach, and less like, you know, talking about virtue ethics, talking about the virtues or the good individual. This is a different kind of framework to think within. Yeah, and in business ethics we have all these different ideologies, and people are representatives of different ideologies.
That almost brings me to the next question. Is it then that the economists in business ethics have failed? Because if I look at whether businesses are indeed getting more of that reputational points, for instance, I rather see the opposite. As a trust researcher, I see that everything goes rather into the opposite direction. What's your view? Has business ethics failed, or are companies becoming better and we don't see it?
Maybe if I add to that, Antoinette, I think we've seen 60 years of corporate social responsibility. And I think the latest statistics, Alicia, that we saw were 91% of people in one of the surveys suggested that capitalism is not providing actual benefits to employees and other stakeholders beyond shareholders. And more than 50% of people don't trust managers to be honest. Right, so by the argument of if business ethics was there to make businesses better, to Antoinette's point, it seems we haven't made that much of progress.
Yeah, I would say like the business ethics discipline is merely an academic discipline, but perhaps that's not too much trickling down to actual companies, right? I think that the link between theory and practice definitely needs to be improved, because what some academics think should be done in organizations is a totally different story compared to what has been done in organizations then, right? And but the problem is, I think most of us are lacking practical experience, working experience in organizations, and that's why it always stays on a somewhat disconnected level. I mean, I've been working for an organization during my PhD, so I know about power barriers, for example, when you want to actually push stuff forward, you know. But yeah, I think in light of lack of this experience, there is not too much connection between academic expertise and actual implementation. That needs to be improved.
One follow-up on this, Alicia. I think you defined, Antoinette, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said goodness is when people inside the organization may have good judgments. I think we are saying that also the organization as a whole, as an actor in society, needs to act well. And here, of course, I think are we judging organizations based on outcomes? So the statistics that we just mentioned probably refer to outcomes and global warming still not being curtailed, etc., or on intentions. And is it the individuals inside the organization, or is it the organization as a collective? What the definition of a good organization? How would you sharpen it on that basis?
I think an either or differentiation doesn't make much sense. You have the organization as a collective framework, and you have the individuals in the organization, and you can't just, I mean, you always need to take into account the two factors, because people make the organization, right? And eventually you speak of the organization as one person, right? So it's always both, in my opinion. Yeah, in terms of, well, you know, how can you judge from intentions? You cannot see them. They are not visible. So you can only judge by outcomes. And when we judge by outcomes, I mean, it's what you said. It doesn't look extremely promising for now. Or it looks as if there's still a hell lot of work to do in that sense, right? And so coming back to the CSR question and, you know, having like looking back at almost, 60, 70 years of CSR, I think that the concept was doomed to fail in the first place because it was never integrated. It was always seen as an add-on. And this is how you do not bring ethics into organizations. When you try to sell them something as an add-on, it's not going to work.
Yeah, whereas by the same token, of course, you just spoke about power and the individuals very often being powerless to impact the context within they find themselves. So Antoinette, I'm thinking that there's also the notion of the organization as a container, as we said, which strongly impacts the, what do we call it in complexity science, the affordances of the members of that system to act beyond the boundaries of that system. But I think that's something we'll probably get to also now when we speak more about virtue ethics. But Antoinette, over to you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I now want to dig a little bit deeper, and then we really go to virtue ethics. But I was just kind of remembering what you wrote about Taoism, and if I understood that correctly, which of course could be not the case, I understood that it's all about taking obstacles away rather than being more too provocative and active. So what obstacles are there inside companies which maybe do not let good people flourish more, if we take that from the outside, that the outcomes are the same as the intentions?
Yeah, I mean, so you're right in your perception that Taoism is more like going with some flow, right? With the idea that there is a natural order, you know, you are within, you cannot completely change and you better adapt to this order than actively pushing for something. So, and when we look at organizations and we see them as an order or in an order framework kind of thing, not a natural though, right, because it was established, nevertheless, we can identify certain barriers to flourishing. And I think a lot of these barriers are constituted by hierarchy, by certain rigid structures which do not empower and enable people to actually take responsibility for what they are doing, to be accountable, and to use or unleash their own level of creativity. So I think this is hindered by a lot of hierarchical structures. Status, right? In insistence on status, on job titles and stuff like that. And I think this is not helpful. Eventually, like perhaps an organization should be more viewed like a community where people really cooperate and not fight against each other for the next stupid job title, you know, and for the next promotion, which comes with this job title and which comes with a higher salary and all this stuff, you know. I don't think that's helpful for humans working together in a productive way. So this would be the first barrier. And that's also something I wrote about in the context of like Taoist philosophy in organizations. It's like this, I mean, also like the Chinese company like Haier, right? They implemented this. It's called leaderless management, or in a more Taoist way, it's like you need to learn to be leader and follower at the same time. You need to have a fluid understanding of roles, at least if you cannot completely like kind of eliminate hierarchy. You need to have a more fluid understanding of roles and do justice to that. Yeah, so I think this is important.
Which I think, and sorry, we're going to be a little bit interruptive, I think, just to get the conversation going. But I think this is very interesting from two perspectives. One, as Carol Sanford always reminds me, I think to be able to take that stand, you require agency. So you actually need to be able to observe yourself in a role in the system, to then also more fluidly probably play these different roles. Because I think what we see in psychology is that not only the system imposes these job titles, people very often also project into the titles and the roles. And we see from statistics and research that over 70% of adults today identify with their role. So there's probably also on the side of the individual a rigidity in almost existentially being connected to the role that they believe they inhabit. And I wonder, one thing that I really liked was a suggestion that we should judge organizations like we judge political systems, which is very much by what type of people they produce, and produce in a very wide sense. So are we creating, so to speak, through the organizations like mini societies, more agentic, more self-determined individuals who can play the role that you described and have more informed judgment, as you said at the beginning? And if organizations today, and I don't know if it's hierarchy, we will query that off Emanuele tomorrow, if it's hierarchy or bureaucracy or any of these constructs, but
competition.
Or competition, right? Market-based competition, right? What is it that drives potentially a lack of such personal development or collective development, right? So I think that could also link the psychological aspects to the philosophical aspects. What has come up for you?
Well, in terms of what now precisely?
So would you judge, I think what I want to explore a little bit more is how to define goodness, maybe also in terms of measures. So I think what I'm suggesting is that in order to get to a good business, we need to create the environment where people develop themselves to become, as you suggest, both fluid in the ways they take up lead and follow roles, and self-manage in a leaderless context, like you just said. Secondly, to attain that practical wisdom in being able to make good judgments in the contextual situations that they find themselves. And then collectively, to do good as an organization. Right, so is that a measure of goodness to say, okay, it creates better people, so to speak, or more mature people? And secondly, the outcomes that collectively these good people produce are good in the context of society?
I think, yeah, I mean, what is goodness, right? How to measure goodness? I think this is very, very difficult because, first of all, you need to set up criteria for what makes something good and what not. I think on an individual level, it would be, I don't know, I see it as counterproductive to rank people according to what kind of level of goodness they have reached. I don't find it productive. But on an organizational level, we could just definitely look out for outcomes. And I mean, what people have been trying, with the impact investing, for example, was to start measuring impact. I mean, in terms of positive impact. And even these guys are struggling with the question how to measure impact. So how do you ever want to measure goodness or like equally like positive outcomes, right? I don't know. I mean, I think in the future we will not get around this question how to measure it. And then, yeah, on an organizational level, I think if we can get our heads around it, it will be possible, right? But I wouldn't know how to approach this for now, right? And then also, like, when we want to measure goodness of a company, I think we need to get to a more integrated understanding of how a company is conducting business, right? Because we could, of course, already measure goodness now by evaluating their CSR projects, right? By looking, hey, what have they done with this community? How much voluntary work did they have spent? How many hours? I mean, companies are already collecting this information, right? But what does it tell us about the actual value of this action, right? It doesn't tell us a lot. So, and then, the thing with measuring is like you only measure for which you have set up criteria, and where you don't have criteria, this will just, go through and you will never have something on paper with regard to this. And on the other hand, there are things you just cannot measure. I mean, it's an illusion that you can just by quantitative terms determine everything. Yeah, but nevertheless, we should start with it, but first of all, we need to develop a more integrated understanding of how business can, I don't know, even serve community is the wrong term. They need to be integrated in communities, in the society again. And then we can think about like, oh yeah, and how do we want to measure this, like outcomes of certain projects now?
Interesting.
Well, yeah, very interesting. And I would want to even dive deeper, but I think we should first go to what I believe is your main expertise. It's more on the individual level, and dig a little bit deeper in what you know about virtues and the good lives in different ethic traditions, because I think here we can really learn a lot. So what are virtues and how do they differ between different traditions you were looking at?
Or maybe if we go one step earlier than that, even say, I don't know if everybody on this call is familiar with virtue ethics, and we will share materials up front so people come prepared. But maybe even before you go to define virtues, do you just want to frame virtue ethics vis-a-vis any other traditions with one sentence, Alicia?
Well, yeah, virtue ethics is the tradition or the ideology within the business ethics discipline that believes in, well, first of all, it's focused on the human being, and then the human being can become virtuous by habitualizing certain, behavior, right? And excelling in that behavior, and by that making a contribution to society. I think that's kind of that there could be different explanations, but that would be my explanation for how I see virtue ethics. It's something you can learn and you need to learn in order to contribute to society.
So and to Antoinette's point, so what's a virtue? Seems a bit like an antiquated and somewhat anachronistic term. Is it just any behavior, or how would you define what is a virtue and what is not?
Yeah, right. So I could read the question already before, and I really had to make my mind up to like what can we do? And I think like in order to decide what is a virtue and what is not a virtue, I found like kind of two guiding questions. So first of all, can you learn this? Yeah, is it something you can learn and you can improve and you can perfectionate eventually? And then secondly, does it contribute to society? I think these are the key questions to determine whether it is a virtuous kind of action or whether you are a virtuous person or not. But one of the cornerstones of virtue ethics is that it goes back to habit, and thus it needs to be something that can be learned by people and it can be improved. Yeah. Unlike, for example, when you take like deontology or you know, like Kant's approach, rule compliance, yeah, it's something you can learn and you can perfectionate, but it's not on the same intrinsic level because that is imposed externally. And virtues come from within, right? You yourself want to excel at that because you yourself want to grow. So there's also this idea of perhaps personal growth in the virtue ethics idea.
And I hear a lot about contributing to society. So, sorry, I cut into you, Antoinette. Do you want to go first? Contributing to society. So one thing Antoinette and I have wondered is, and we will come to the eastern side of the question, I think, in a second, does it imply suffering? So is there an idea that I need to give up on something through those virtuous habits in contribution to the greater good or to the society around me? Is that a constituting aspect?
I would say hopefully not, because that would make it a bit negative. Like, I mean, seriously, what's that? That's a very depressing logic to look at things. Like, I mean, saying like, well, you know, you can only contribute to the common good if you yourself, you know, withdraw from stuff, take a back seat, make compromises, you know, and then you think like, why the heck should I do this, right? I mean, there's all the intrinsic.
Let's go. I agree with you, but let's go to walls, so to speak, and the veil of ignorance. So let's go to the idea of a social contract, right, where individuals have negative freedoms and they really only contract with each other based on their own individualistic, hedonistic kind of or utilitarian beliefs. That type of worldview wouldn't imply, for example, that I go out of my way to do something for my neighbor. It's also kind of, maybe suffering is too harsh, but it could be sacrifice, a sacrifice of time that I have for myself, and I rather call my mother, kind of thinking about the Chinese rating system of how good people are in taking care of their elders and so on. So is there a degree of giving up something that in a negative freedom worldview would not necessarily be expected of you?
Well, that depends on your frame of mind, I think, because you can frame it in a negative way, and then it's like, oh, you got to compromise, or you can frame it in a positive way in the sense of, oh, for you, it's actually a great learning opportunity. So I think there is no clear answer to the question. It depends on the framing. And I personally would always frame it like it's a great opportunity, and and the other larger frame which plays into this is like, either you see yourself as an intrinsic part of the community or you just don't, and you cannot force this, right? If this identification is not there, of course you will view everything as a constraint and as a compromise. So I think it's very much related to your inner attitude to your social environment, and this is how you're going to frame it for yourself. So the frame matters, I think, and the frame is also then a motivator or not.
So that I hear two different aspects here. The last one was there might be individual differences, which is something I haven't yet teased out so clearly. What does this mean for trying to get these virtuous habituated practices? Does it mean that some people just have to practice much longer? And the second thing I think is a big difference is which virtue ethic approach you're taking. I mean, I have the feeling that we hear a little bit of Catholic Aristotelian virtue ethic in one sense here, and might be very different in the traditions you are looking at. So maybe you can try to develop first maybe the different traditions, which helps us to go even deeper towards that question, and then maybe it would be really interesting, and something we didn't find very clearly, what about individual differences? Again, that might differ across these traditions.
Okay, so I mean, I think like your other question, like in terms of differentiate between the virtue ethics traditions, was aiming at like, okay, are there any differences in virtues and practice of virtues, right? So yeah, I think each culture defines what is virtuous behavior, right? So it's definitely culture dependent, because that is what the culture sees as an ideal to strive for. And so, of course, in Aristotle times and also in times nowadays, we have different ideas of what makes a person a virtuous person. And for example, those Aristotelian virtues from back then, like, 500 BC, may not exactly applicable today or may not be that relevant, right? I mean, Aristotle wrote a lot about like money spending and how what are the appropriate ways of how to deal with money and stuff like that, or like he also had like values where I think like, okay, can women identify with this like more like manly kind of, virtues, like, because it was a different society, right? So in any case, like when we look back and the virtue ethics traditions, no matter at which culture we're looking at, it goes back to around 500 BC. We need to kind of perhaps adjust or adapt whatever we've read about those virtues. So, and as I said, like Aristotle for me is a bit dated in terms of his conception. And the other thing about Aristotle's conception is that I find it, the idea was for Aristotle, a virtue is always in between two extremes. Yeah? So the mean is the virtue. Yeah, and the challenging question is, how do you hit the mean? How do you make sure it is the mean? And so, intellectually, this might be a bit challenging for just anyone to practice. But when we look at, for example, the Asian traditions like Confucianism, for example, or Taoism, they don't define it that clearly that, oh yeah, it's always between two extremes where to find the virtue, right? Confucius defined it in terms of, well, and now we come back also to a kind of outdated concept. Virtue is defined in accordance with hierarchical level, role, and responsibility. And in that sense, virtuous behavior is appropriate behavior with regard to your role and status in society. So it's very simple, right? Everyone can understand it, but at the same time, it's a bit rigid. And also, like for our societies, striving more for egalitarian kind of structure is not really applicable. And in Taoism, it's again different because what is virtuous is completely disconnected from society because it was the counter idea to Confucianism. And so what is virtuous is what is in accordance with nature, right? Which is in accordance with the natural order and does not interfere with the natural order. And there we end up in a totally different range of virtues. Yeah, like for example, in Confucianism and Taoism, we have both humbleness, or humility, but they are differently motivated. In Taoism, you're humble because you accept the order as the higher order, and you make the most of it when you don't go against it. In Confucianism, you got to be humble because it may be dictated by your role or status, right? There's a significant difference. Yeah. So I hope that answers your questions with regard to the different virtue ethics traditions and how virtue is defined. So different frames.
I want to dive into two things that came up before we go into the second part of the question. On the so I think this Tao notion is very interesting for me, and I think, and I pronounced this incorrectly, but this Wu Wei kind of action through inaction, I think links to that concept, right? Which I think is very fashionable. And I'm encountering more and more people who tell me that kind of what is good, or life is perfect as it is. And then kind of even in Buddhism, I think this notion of avoiding suffering, which also relates to Stoicism. So they kind of, is there a danger of inaction in some of these philosophies? And then I want to contrapose that with something Luigino Bruni suggested, where it almost sounded like for a virtue like courage, for example, is at its very purest when it actually starts to challenge the social order. So there seems to be a notion that stepping up when it costs you, when, to Antoinette's kind of trust, when you become vulnerable to do what is right and display moral courage, seems to be the highest virtue almost, which puts other virtues into danger, like prudence. But you probably shouldn't do that if you were thinking about yourself. So what is this balance? And I think, Antoinette, you talked about obedience versus virtue. So is there something here in these different traditions that we can look at?
Well, with the Taoism, of course, there are certain limitations to this philosophy. And one is that it may lead to a Stoic kind of attitude, right? Because, I mean, it's not about taking courage, it's about understanding deeply understanding your environment and understand what you can do within these environmental constraints, right? So this is, these are like two different frameworks, right? It's like Taoism is very much focused on working within constraints, whereas typical Western approach is like kind of overcoming constraints. Yeah, it's a different logic, different approach, and so I think the key challenge lies in, and I could see that with myself, having adapted to a Taoist worldview after a while of, kind of consuming all these books, is being back in my world again, in Germany. I have to understand in which situations I rather try to work within the constraints and where is the time or the context to go and to overcome those constraints. And so I think the key advantage lies in when you have become a hybrid, you still need to learn to differentiate between the situations, but you can act in accordance to almost any situation, right? Because you got the two frameworks.
So I think this leads back to your point about identity, I think, because only if you're able to let go of your own identity and step into different roles and different perspectives, do you have the freedom to act with kind of a higher rationale than automated drivers, so to speak, in that context, right? Which I think, Antoinette, I've forgotten the name of the person who suggested that, but it almost links to this notion of identity is not something that we find if we dig long enough and deeply enough into ourselves, but we are a mess of acquired practices almost that we accept as being ourselves, and therefore challenging some of these practices that are related to roles and being able to do that in a conscious fashion, I think almost entails that freedom. But Antoinette, I can't remember what the name of the person was, but what has come up for you?
I think Alicia even recommended that to us, the TED Talk. So a very interesting anthropologist, I think so, studying and philosopher, but he's also anthropologist. But just a little bit building on that, what I'm hearing here is also a little bit, you can have but that's now really layman. You can have Taoism more like in this whole consciousness movement. So it's a lot about getting conscious, stepping ahead of you on the balcony and being able to see things. Whereas when it's then about how to act in a situation where maybe courage would be needed, you would then turn to a slightly more active virtue ethics version. So are you saying we should do a pragmatic virtue ethics where we kind of try to merge the things together?
Yeah, I would definitely suggest a pragmatic approach. I think we should not reduce ourselves just to one method. It doesn't make sense. Life is too complex, right? And so for some situations, a more Taoist outlook may be helpful, but then in other situations, you need to realize, oh yeah, it's urgent that I actually act upon that. And for me, that's the art of life. To combine different methods and understanding in what situation which method is actually appropriate, right? I would never reduce, like after that experience in China, I would never reduce myself just to one framework, which brings me back to Otti's identity thing. I think we also need to understand identity in a more fluid way. It's not static, right? We change throughout our lives. Our identity to some extent goes with it, It's nothing like we were born with and it just stays with us all our life.
But I still hear a little bit postmodernism here, in the sense because you can have fluid identities and still try to integrate it, as some psychologists are kind of telling us, which is what in the end, if you have virtues as practices, is happening. So can you maybe reflect a little bit on that? Because I think that would bring us all a step further if we wouldn't have anything goes in the background, kind of.
You mean like, well, identity and integration and consistency and stuff like that?
Well, I think you can have various identities, but your inner self still wants to integrate it in a certain sense. And it could be that exactly these virtuous habitual practices are a part of that integration. So I see almost a connection here.
Yeah, it could be. I haven't looked at it in that way, but I think like, yeah, there is perhaps some core, right? But on the outside, it's more like moving around. But yeah, what I could witness with myself in China, I mean, if I hadn't had a core, I would have fully adapted, but I didn't, right? There were still some things where I thought like, oh, I don't want to adapt, or I just can't. For example, when we look at how they do their social relations, how they manage their social relations, I can see that, I can identify that, but I cannot mimic it. It's impossible for me because I was not socialized in this way. And this is where we come to the limits of, adaptation, and also like, okay, what's the core of our identity? Where are the things we just cannot overcome, right? Which is not a bad thing, right? So it's, yeah. And then, of course, yeah, I mean, you're right. It's like ideally people should strive for integration, for like coherence to some extent in their personality, because otherwise it's perhaps a bit schizophrenic and a bit like erratic, in terms of character and stuff. So I think always like trying to create a narrative of one's life. This is a way how to, bring in consistency, or explaining, in front of yourself, like why you did this and justifying this, and then bringing in like coherence in that way. Yeah, through a narrative you tell about your life.
Which almost brings me to kind of this dichotomy of culture versus character. And one thing that came up for me was that maybe instead of all this focus on culture, where we try to test culture and use culture almost in a manipulative way within the current system, it's much more about shaping up character, even at an organizational level, to re-observe what is happening, what are the practices, what is our narrative at this point in time, and again, testing it against what you said at the beginning. Does it add value to society? Is it right? But I wanted to, one final thing, and then I guess we won't go into the depth of virtues. I mean, Antoinette and I have probably, when we stopped counting, Antoinette, we should count. I think we have 155 virtues or something, 15 different virtue scales that are being suggested in order to measure the application of such virtues. And I think we will probably come back to you at some stage to ask for some help on kind of how do we cluster, categorize which ones are virtues or not. But that aside, I wanted to ask one more layman question, building on Antoinette. So virtue ethics, and sorry, this is truly layman, versus pragmatism, i.e. William James and then kind of the newer American traditions of philosophy. Because what you just said also in the fluidity, in the contextualism, in the adaptation to identity, is that getting similar to the notion of pragmatism as a philosophical movement? And then secondly, which again is a theoretical question, and just very quickly, we haven't found any true operationalization of virtue ethics, be that at a societal level or at an organization level. Beyond Solomon, who creates some principles and so on, or McIntyre, but it's very theoretical and very removed from the practicalities of what Antoinette and I would consider an organizational model or theory. So first question, pragmatism, is there any connection? And second question, why has nobody tried to operationalize? And is it intrinsically impossible?
Yeah, so I think there is a link between pragmatism and virtue ethics. So I came across pragmatism through John Dewey, and I was wondering why I really like to read his stuff. And then I digged up his biography or stuff about this, and it turns out he was in China. And pragmatism you learn in China. And I think that kind of really influenced I think he had developed the school of pragmatism in the US, or he was one of the leading figures. And I think what he had seen in China has influenced his view, same as what I have seen in China influenced my degree of pragmatism. And virtue ethics is a very pragmatic approach to life. I mean, although I find the Eastern approach even more pragmatic than, Aristotle's mean. But it's the most, I think, in my opinion, it's the most pragmatic approach to a good life. So yeah, pragmatism and virtue ethics for me go hand in hand. Although, of course, I mean, when you look at it more closely, there may be differences, but on the surface, virtue ethics is a pragmatic tradition, in my opinion. And then, the second thing, operationalization, I mean, the interesting thing is, or isn't that actually weird that after Solomon, no one else dealt with this question? It came to be like it was in fashion once for a very short period, and then it dropped again. And now it's coming up, but still no one is dealing with this question. And I think this is because we are so much framed in the way that virtues are about the individual. And I don't know, I mean, that gives us actually the great opportunity to develop something ourselves, right? But it still apparently needs to be developed. But one thing that could help us with is that when we look at Chinese philosophy, it's actually political philosophy. Chinese philosophy was written for the ruler, so to understand how to guide a people, right? And so when we see a corporation as the people to be guided, you know, in the context of like governance, for example, leadership, then I think we can get a lot from Chinese philosophy. But because like from what I got from Aristotle, I mean, he also wrote about state philosophy, but I'm not quite sure whether he linked the virtue ethics to state philosophy and running the state. But the Chinese philosophers definitely did this.
Although
very interesting, and maybe we need, and in fact, we refer to Plato. Sorry, Antoinette, go on.
No,
but I mean, Antoinette, at least I think we got confirmation from a kind of qualified source that our project makes sense also in the philosophy domain, which I find very pleasing. But
we're going to note that and be very happy about that. But I was just so triggered by what you were saying, because when I was reading your stuff and other business essayists, which at present try to go into that direction, it came to me that it's really, really difficult, because some view companies as mini societies, which is a little bit more towards what you were suggesting. Whereas when I was reading, especially also your things and that special symposium you were hosting on that topic, it was also maybe it's just some kind of a family construct. So can you elaborate a little bit how maybe also in your three different traditions an organization would be conceptualized? Because I think there are some conceptualizations out there.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, so Chinese philosophy was political philosophy, but the smallest social unit they always looked at least in Confucianism, was the family. So there was no smaller unit. There was no such idea of like, you know, the individual. And then they had like 3 concentric circles around the family. So the behavior within the family was also ideally resembling the behavior within the state, right? So first within the community and then within the state. So family, community, state. That's the major idea of harmony in Chinese society, right? But it goes back to Confucianism, which is a bit limiting. And then what we could witness in practice in China was in the 1980s, during the opening up reform, we had these so-called town village enterprises, which were usually family-based, and these were the motor of the Chinese economy, right, for at least 10, 20 years. So they were driving the economic growth in China. And I suppose the same, you know, ideas of role, responsibility and stuff they had in the family was then one-to-one was then adapted to the town village enterprises, where you also had, you know, the whole family. Like back then we had larger families, right? So I think through the town village enterprise organization we could learn perhaps something, but on the other hand, on a more abstract level, we could also get it directly from the philosophy, because when we think about a ruler governing the people, like, we may also get some ideas. But yeah, what's missing is that these are not systematically framed for now. And of course, in Chinese philosophy, there is no concept of good business. That doesn't exist. Historically, the merchants who were doing business were the lowest of 4 groups in society. And so that kind of explains why they never explicitly dealt with, oh yeah, what's the idea of good business? Yeah.
Which probably resonates with Aristotle to a degree. But I think at this point, I would call it a break on the first part, because otherwise in the last kind of 20, 25 minutes, we will not get to the other 2 sections. And Antoinette, I will ask you for your help in just maybe also for the listeners, because we've crossed so many bridges, to just briefly highlight our key conclusions. And I will try on the first one, what is good business? I think we came to the conclusion that on the one hand, it is about developing the individuals and good judgment. On the other hand, however, Alicia said also in terms of measuring the outcomes of the business and what it does in society was important. Then in terms of virtue ethics and some comparisons, I think, again, we dug into the difference between the Aristotelian mean, being somewhat rational and also somewhat difficult to implement concept vis-a-vis Confucian, which might be easier because it's a straight comparison to what were the social rules, so to speak, or rituals of the dynasty that he was referring to, vis-a-vis Taoism, much more fluid, much more feeling the connectedness, as Alicia said, adapting within the constraints as opposed to trying to adapt the constraints. It's also some of the key thoughts that I captured. Antoinette, please add, and then Alicia, please add maybe another sentence just so that we have the gist of what we came up with.
For me, very important was your first statement, how to distinguish virtues. You mentioned two things. It's habituated practice, so you can learn it. It's practice, which you're doing your whole life and getting better at it. And it always is linked to the common good. I think you did use another word, but I mean, I like this two distinction because it's very, very helpful in this jungle out there with everybody coming up with a new virtue. And the second thing, which I found quite interesting, is this pragmatic stance, which you kind of also reflected back to your own life, that you can have something like Taoism more as a baseline, and that's probably also why it's so attractive. It's a lot about this conscious movement, but at the same time, then adapt to a different environment and still have their look for what is virtuous in that environment. And that could be then courage, for instance, which is not in other environments.
Yeah, I think that's well summarized. I have a few add-ons. So coming back to the good business, right, and getting more on the level of the collective or the organization, I think it's very important that the organization as such has enabling structures, right? So when we think about it more strategically, it doesn't help when we only have good individuals in an organization, because we all know they will not flourish if we don't have appropriate structures to enable such flourishing, right? So when you want to have a good organization with good people, you got to make sure you have the structures in place for that. The second thing is on Chinese philosophy. I think the major difference I encounter between Western and Chinese philosophy is that Chinese philosophy is so much more intuitive, right? It's not about this high-minded abstract thinking. It's more about, hey, what can I do specifically in my own life to have a good life, whatever that is according to Taoist or Confucian principles, right? So this intuition, and that's what you see in China. People are much more driven by intuition. I wouldn't say that exclusively makes a good life, right? But if you sometimes also go into a more intuitive level, I think that really helps. And then the last thing is with the Taoism, I can tell you this philosophy gives you a lot of peace. It makes you more peaceful. And I think that's important. I mean, for me, it really relieved myself of a lot of burdens, in that sense. So, but yeah, here I understood it's time to differentiate again and see what I need to apply in what situation.
Which resonates with me immediately, the Marx quote famously on his tombstone in Highgate Cemetery, right, where he suggested philosophy is not only there to interpret the world, but to change it. And I guess this is what drives me personally, for sure, to sometimes say, yes, kind of letting go of everything and avoiding suffering and reframing and being more mindful sometimes as a hedonistic endeavor can be useful, especially in situations of personal crisis or pain. But I think there has to be that, as you say, that acknowledgement sometimes that we might need to change circumstances because life might call us into that role for whatever reason at times, and we should see to live up to that, I guess. But let me go into the second part. So beautiful. It was already very informative, certainly for me. Second part, and probably 10, 15 minutes, let's try to be a little bit crisp, I guess, how to make organizations good. And it directly relates to what you just said. So I think you said make sure that the environment is there, that the practices are there, so that organizations actually have a chance, or individuals inside those organizations actually have a chance to be good, to do good. And I think what we will do, Antoinette, is just fire a few questions, because of course we created a heat map on this. We looked at various organizational theories and models, from Thiel to Agile to Holacracy, Sociocracy, and so on. So I think we will just explore a little bit in a rapid fire way, and then maybe go into a few questions that interest us most. So I want to fire a first question. Maybe just let's do a rapid fire response as well on implications for corporate governance. And I'm especially thinking about Colin Myers and prosperity, where Colin is suggesting that, yes, we need to take into account organizations are only such by public fiat. Therefore, they have a necessity, independent of Friedman and others arguing the opposite, to be anchored, like you suggest, in the society. They are part of the society, and economy and society are intertwined in that regard. And that needs to always be the anchor for acting of any organization. And he's suggesting that, therefore, we should probably change even the principles of incorporation, but we should also potentially change the accounting and have other types of capital, not only short-term financial capital, but human capital, natural capital, other things that more adequately correspond to the interests of society as a supra kind of anchor point. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of Chinese philosophy, I'm really struggling with how to reconcile it with modern Western concepts such as corporate governance, you know. But what just came to my mind is when you mentioned the capital stuff, is like, is capital actually the right framing for now? I mean, capitalism, right? That's the same logic. And I'm wondering whether we still want to feed the same logic, or whether whatever we call now human capital, social capital, whatever capital, whether perhaps a new framing is actually necessary to get away from this capital notion. I don't know. I find it a bit constraining. I don't find it's too much in the typical economic logic, which gives us too much constraints. So that was my first thought just about this. But yeah, for the corporate governance thing, like, yeah, we need to think about embeddedness. We need to go back to the idea that everything is embedded. And that's very difficult for a Western mindset because we never learned embeddedness. We always learned to isolate, right? To categorize, to classify. And so we need to get away from this kind of approach and think more in embedded terms. I think that would help. But yeah, it's not directly related to corporate governance. May play out on this level, but it's not directly related.
We will have at some stage Freeman talking about care ethics and stakeholders. Maybe we get a little bit closer there, who knows? I mean, but I think your point of embeddedness is a very important one. We were saying firing, so I'm interested in your flourishing practices. But I want to make it a little bit more difficult because you already told us it's empowerment, it's decentralization. I buy all that. But I read that trust is very important, at least in the Confucian logic. So I was really interested, how do you cultivate trust? I was even thinking, are there maybe even some negative nudging so that you are not going to be untrustworthy? So what would you say on this account? If we take trust as an example, how can you enable that virtue?
Well, from a Confucian perspective, of which I'm not the biggest fan, right? But just speaking from that perspective, trust is generated through close relationships, and that start with a family. And that also puts limitations to trust relationships because you got this concentric arrangement of, social relations. And once you encounter someone you have never met in your life before at a very late point of your life, you will have trust issues naturally coming from this, view on social relations. And that's different, I think, to Western perspectives on trust, right? I mean, I don't know, we don't have these constraints on perhaps developing trust relationships. But I'm not too much into that. But well, definitely trust is an important factor in flourishing and feeling safe, in like psychological safety, right? So this is something that I would see like related to this.
I don't really see how that is, for instance, ingrained in rituals. You can also take a Taoist perspective here. I'm just kind of interested because you were saying that organizations can enabling flourishing, and if this is part of it, maybe that was also too difficult, but I was just kind of wondering because that really goes back also to this contributing to the common good and solidarity aspect in common.
Where I want to build, Antoinette, on what you said, because I think you came into sanctioning. So maybe, one, is trust important and how is that reflected in a virtuous enterprise? And secondly, has therefore the organization also a role in asking for solidarity and trust and sanction that if it's not occurring, which seems to be something in China quite prevalent with this whole social scoring mechanisms and accepted. So is there almost, at least from an Eastern standpoint, almost a deontological aspect of this, which also resonates with the church, right? So if you are enlightened, you don't need the 10 commandments, but if you're not, then you stick to the rules, otherwise you're in trouble. I don't know.
Yeah, well, the China thing is a more complicated issue, and I come back to that. But yeah, I mean, trust is not a notion that is really there in Taoism, so it's very difficult to answer the question from that perspective. And it's, of course, it's very prevalent in Confucian kind of ideas of social relationships, but then we get to the limitations. And these limitations of...
Can I kind of, I think it is in Tao, but maybe not the way you see it, but I think being humble, do not interfere.
Yeah.
A little bit servant leadership idea. Now, this is the Western terminology. That to me has a lot to do with trusting. And
they are producing trust. Yeah, they can be enabler of trust, but it's not that this philosophy explicitly talks about trust. Yeah, so I would see them as enabler of trust relationships, most definitely. Yeah, but yeah, no explicit kind of dealing with this otherwise, right? And coming to China, so, you know, ideally what we can see is like trust is something which should come intrinsically, like, you know, the belief in people, and it should not be imposed, because otherwise actually we need to be wondering, is trust something that can be imposed at all? And I mean, this is exactly what China is doing now currently with the social credit score. But when we look at the actual picture, it's compliance. And I'm wondering whether compliance can lead to trust. I mean, you can get to a certain like level of trust, but you will not go beyond this just by mere compliance, right? And this is exactly the problem we have in organizations. Mere compliance mechanisms will not instill really significant trust relations. This needs to come like intrinsically motivated by certain values people believe in. Yeah. And for example, also like attitudes, being humble, you know, moderation and stuff like that. Yeah, kindness is a very important value, I think, in cooperation.
And I think on this one, Antoinette, always, my memory is getting so bad. Is it Cizon or Sasson? I always forget. Our friend from Spain. Or Latin America. Sasson. I think he's very explicit about this, right? In his handbook for business ethics, he said, the compliance movements, and the moment that you turn virtues or ethics into rule, you actually create a contraposing mechanism which creates disengagement from the very morality. And I think Antoinette has written in our recent article about the fact that the moment that you incentivize solidarity, you're eroding the very basics for people feeling solidaric. And I think that brings me to kind of maybe one of the final questions in this section about, so if we think about rituals and practices and what you said earlier and about enabling or potentially also sanctioning the right virtuous behaviors or virtuous attitudes, then what are the most important and what are the most dangerous ones? And I think we are talking about kind of some are the ones that enable flourishing and give life, and the others are life suckers, so to speak, that destroy liveliness in organizations. And maybe I give you one frame, and maybe Antoinette has another. We were trying to get closer to this topic by looking at organizational functions and processes from one lens. And what we see is governance processes, so strategy and how you decide short-term and long-term objectives and then cascade them and so on. Practices day-to-day of managing the firm and kind of integrating different teams and different people into the production and decision-making of day-to-day activities. And finally, the motivation practices, or typical performance management, incentives, how to get people to do what they should be doing, which of course in a traditional way is very one-directional. And so the assumption you already said, the belief is that people are good. I think Antoinette will argue that traditionally the belief was people are trying their very best to avoid being good or avoid being contributive to the organization. So governance functions or steering functions vis-a-vis the day-to-day management, decision-making, collaboration in teams vis-a-vis incentivization, motivation. If we take these three categories, if they're helpful, have you got any thoughts about kind of things you've seen or in your seminars with Hire and so on, what stuck out for you in relevant virtuous practices, or what's the opposite, non-virtuous practices that we can learn from?
Thwarting virtues, yeah.
Thwarting virtues.
Yeah, so I think Hire is still a good example for that. I mean, it's the only practical example, which is a company which is actually really taking up Taoist values. So when we look at the governance level, what we can see with Hire is like, well, they took a very specific approach in terms of steering their business, and that was like separating it into micro businesses, right? And so giving these micro business or enterprises full autonomy and full responsibility, right? Because autonomy and responsibility go together. I cannot make a judgment, not a final judgment, whether this is a virtuous approach or not, right? People in the organization need to judge upon that question, whether they think like it's you know, bringing the organization ahead or not, yeah? Whether it's like productive or fruitful. I would just say, because I believe in autonomy and responsibility, it looks like a good approach, right? But I cannot give a qualified statement on that. In terms of day-to-day management, I think, I know not everyone is made for this, but in general, I think most of us would appreciate letting go of control, letting go of micromanagement of us, you know, within organizations, giving us more space to participate, to contribute things which are closer to our own capacities, capabilities, and personality. Creating a more inclusive organization that really values our personality as such and not just a certain number of skills. And I think that has to do with governance, but also very much with day-to-day management. But you also need to have people having a feeling for people's talents and their capacities, right? You need to have people with this kind of mindset, with this horizon to make this judgment and see, okay, this person needs perhaps some more support there. So it's a very tricky issue when it comes to large organizations, I think. And then lastly, yeah, the incentives, like I'm not a fan of incentives, right? Because as you rightly said, it may erode the intrinsic motivation. So, and we all know incentives have their dark sides. I think Antoinette knows much more about this than me. And so the question is, how do you enable intrinsic motivation, right? It's like you got to create a spirit, right? So I think the emphasis should not be so much on a compliance culture, even though this is a necessary part, of course, of business nowadays. You need to create a spirit in the company. And I'm not quite sure whether this works with companies of any sizes, but perhaps more with the smaller ones. And then the question is, how do you create the spirit? And that brings me back to the idea of rituals, right? I mean, ritual sounds a bit archaic, right? A bit like dated. But when you understand what Michael Pewitt said in the video about, like, you know, just a certain communication practice where people step into each other's role, this is also a kind of ritual, or you can ritualize it, right? To, for example, increase a better understanding of each other's position, right? So think about like certain practices you repeat with people in the organization so they understand as part of the company spirit, and it helps them to develop, you know. So changing perspectives, I think, within a company should be a frequent kind of exercise as a form of a ritual, for example.
I think I would like to dig into one thing, because I believe that you may be the only person who is able to answer that. I was kind of thinking whether, I mean, you left it open, whether people are virtuous actors in hire. But assuming they are, at least in China, with all the things you were saying, giving autonomy, giving freedom, giving responsibility, at the same time, they do have very strong incentives, in my opinion. You are having an internal competition as well, which we find in some contexts to be highly difficult. And I even read in Taoism, you shouldn't attach yourself too strongly to material goods. So I was kind of thinking, does this work in China because they have embodied that you shouldn't attach yourself too strongly to material goods, and that's why that's not a problem? Or, and that would have a consequence, because then we couldn't copy hire just like that for our Western context. So I am very interested in that as well. How much does that transfer?
Yeah, I can elaborate a bit on this. So first of all, what we need to understand about the hire case is that hire is very unique in the landscape of Chinese businesses, right? So, in the sense that the CEO always emphasized values like, you know, which are modeled after Taoism, like being like water, right? This is the biggest theme in the higher corporate philosophy. And being like water means being humble, kind, supportive, all that stuff. So this needs to be the general attitude of every employee that is working for hire. And it's also interesting that the hire CEO actually stated they want to avoid competition, and I think they did so by product differentiation. So they never, you know, got into this, oh yeah, we need to we need to compete on this market share, but instead they said like, oh yeah, let's create a different product, so, and by that getting market share. So this was their strategy, and that's a very Taoist kind of strategy in my opinion, trying to avoid competition wherever possible, because it's just going to drain you, it's wearing you out. I don't know so much about intercompany competition. There may be competition, but I also know about the micro enterprises that these are actually ad hoc creations due to a customer demand. And of course, then like micro enterprises may deal with competing customer demands, but I'm not quite sure whether this is internally a very competitive, in the sense of aggressive, organization. I didn't speak to people directly. I can only judge from the surveys. I don't have the impression from the surveys, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing is, material goods. I mean, when we talk about China today, it's an ultra materialist society. We have post-materialism, or like, being on the way to post-materialism, but China is ultra materialistic. And so of course, like whatever I'm talking about today, Taoist philosophy, also like in higher executive trainings or stuff, we're not talking about China today. Higher may be a glimpse of hope in that sense, because I try to practice that, but this doesn't speak for the majority of Chinese business or for society at large in China. It's about status, it's about materialism.
But it actually means that you cannot just transfer that, but you have to embody then the whole philosophy behind in order to really make that running. That's what I kind of hear.
And I think, adding to that, sorry, interjecting, what I'm also hearing, Antoinette, is when we talked about solidarity and Buddha's work, in my mind, I go back also to Vogt, for example, and your point on care ethics, right? I think what we're seeing in some of the companies that are able to evoke that daemon, which is the spirit, right? Eudaimonia is the good spirit. And Alicia, you talked, funnily enough, about the spirit of the enterprise. And I think some of the organizations that evoke that good spirit have very strong norms. I think our friends in Vogt tell us that they trust people a lot, because there is an embodied norm that people behave good by each other. And frankly, if they don't, they're out, right? And I think you're being like water. I guess people who don't fit the culture, or maybe make that a question, people who don't fit the culture, I guess, will find it very difficult to survive in higher then. And I think one axis of exploration for Antoinette and I will be to understand the intra-company competition, also provoked by this level of being 1.5 times as much as effective as the sector, etc., in the micro enterprises or the systems of ecosystems. I think nurtures such competitive behavior, but I think that we leave that aside for now. But what about if people are not sticking to the culture? Let me make that a question.
So I mean, the case with hire is like, it's about self-selection. People who don't have an entrepreneurial spirit, they know they won't get a chance to enter the organization. And if they cannot grow within the organization, they will feel uncomfortable, I think, and just leave the organization. They may not be even kicked out, but they may decide for themselves that this is not an appropriate place, and it puts too much pressure on them, right? Because that's what we could hear about this entrepreneurial spirit, that it's adding pressure to people. But then talking shortly about like whether it can be transferred or not. So we have a similar phenomenon with Japanese management and Kaizen and total quality management and all that stuff, and Lean, for example. And what people back in the 90s didn't get about Japanese management is you got to import it wholesale. It's not a technique, it's a whole culture you need to import. And the same is true for the higher case. You can only kind of emulate higher strategies if you start emulating the cultural practices outside as an environment, right? And so that's the thing, And
I think you see that very clearly, right? GE Appliances has not really embraced exactly the same structure. Neither has the European division of hire, right? I think, but I will drive us a little bit into the third section, and I think I haven't watched the time boundaries very closely because I love the conversation. I think we should give it the space, but maybe let's conclude within 15 minutes. And Antoinette, can I ask you maybe, and then Alicia to comment, if we crunch up this part? So the question was, how do we nurture, or how do we craft good organizations based on our first round? What are the maybe just 3 things that came up as a summary for our listeners and for ourselves? That strike me. And then I will ask Antoinette, I will ask you to introduce the final section, which is about leadership. And Alicia, you already spoke a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think what resonated very strongly with me was that we were able to pinpoint a little bit more the different possible conceptualization of businesses, although that's not at all clear, but there seems to be a possibility to look at firms as families, as communities, and as societies. That seems to be there somewhere to tease it out. And you were also saying have a look at political philosophy in addition. Of course, I found it interesting that trust, while in my opinion, it's even a central concept in Taoism, seems not to be seen as something we need to nurture in a certain sense. Of course, you didn't say that, but it's kind of interesting that that doesn't feature up in their explanations, although even kindness is one of the most important aspects in trust. So that's really, really interesting. And I found, of course, the last discussion also very interesting. The strong philosophical background, which kind of then really tells you, do not attach yourself to materialism. It's about humbleness, it's about kindness. That then makes it possible that you work with certain methods, such as a limited degree of internal competition, as you kind of told us, without having the negative consequences. And that I find very interesting. And of course, the whole transferability question, I think it was only Toyota, by the way, who was able to rebuild kind of the same system in the US, and it took them a very long time. But they were. But it's just should make us mindful that we not should just blindly transfer so-called best practices.
But do you know why Toyota succeeded in building exactly the same culture? Because in recruitment they selected after for personality and not just for skills, and this is a typical Japanese approach to watch out for the personality, and this is what Western companies are often not doing. They just go for the skills.
Yeah, I would disagree here a little bit, but I think every good company who wants to have trust and solidarity is doing this, and there are a number of companies which are doing this. But I completely agree with you. If you want to have strong community, there is no way around it. And by the way, it was interesting that you didn't say, what do we do with the people who don't fit? But probably in Taoism they just go, which is happening. But in at least Western companies, we see that if you keep these bad apples, it very soon destroys the whole company culture. So I found that
famous no asshole rule that Antoinette is very keen about. But okay, Alicia, anything else that you want to crunch up for this section that you want to highlight for anyone listening?
Yeah, there's one thing I want to highlight, also in terms of how do we deal with this on a global level where we have different understandings of values or virtues. I think it's extremely important to not just reduce ourselves to specific terms. So for example, trust, right? We also need to look at, okay, what are the enablers of trust, such as in Taoism, and then we can build a link, right? But when we just watch out for trust for a single term, we may not find it in every philosophy we have on this globe, right? And for example, when we frame something as care ethics, right, that even the notion of care may not be explicit in other philosophies, right? So we need to be careful in order to create something which is perhaps globally applicable or applicable on a more global level, that we don't reduce ourselves on just specific terms, and we just, and we're not too fixated on this kind of on specific terms. I think we always need to have broader notions of terms and enablers of these terms, and then we can perhaps create I don't know, a model which is more broadly applicable, not just in a Western context, perhaps.
Very interesting. I'm looking forward to also having our friend Richard Clyden to talk about this very subject. Language matters, and he was talking about communication games and some of the Hegelian and Wittgenstein theory around this. So, and we were looking at Habermas and dialogic ethics and so on, but that we will certainly not touch on today. What also resonated with me was this notion of context. I will speak to Michele Zanini again about meritocracy in a short while, and I think kind of there is a notion that maybe merit isn't the problem, but the embeddedness in a certain mindset in philosophy, exactly like you just said with the Chinese culture. And I think we will also speak to, I guess, Stefano Zamani at some stage, who I think would argue that markets are not necessarily amoral. It's what you bring into the market. And if you look at Adam Smith, not only in terms of the origin of wealth, but the sentiments of, what was it called? I've forgotten. Sentiments of...
Moral sentiments.
Theory of moral sentiments.
Theory of moral sentiments. Thank you very much. I'm a philosopher apprentice, and therefore, I take on my Joker card. I think there is a very simplistic view sometimes of what some of these people suggested in reality in regards to how markets could function. And I think meritocracy has been abused to a degree within the current paradigm. And final thing, Brian Angard was always saying that the dominant paradigm has that nasty property of incorporating all others. So if you're not very careful, you're using a word, you're using a term, but you're interpreting it from the dominant paradigm's perspective, which then just makes out of everything a nail if you've got your hammer, so to speak. And with that, I would suggest let's surf quickly, maybe in 5 minutes or so, to the leadership topic. And Antoinette, I will hand over to you again. And I think the key question that we will finish on is, of course, the question of today's seminar, which was, do we need philosopher CEOs? But in that context, let's first hear a little bit more about leaders, and then we get there. Antoinette.
Exactly, and that question is especially reserved to you. I'm interested in what you have written already in your PhD thesis, but want to bring that a little bit further. I know that you are a firm believer that it's very important for managers to understand the worldview they're operating in, to look under the iceberg. So you have looked at neoliberal ideology and what the consequences of that are. Maybe just give us 3 sentences on that, because I would also like you to elaborate what it is, and I'm certainly saying it the wrong way, but what is it if you have a third way China ideology in your mind? What is the consequences then for that?
Yeah, the neoliberal question, I mean, that's really long ago now. But yeah, I mean, what I got from like working on like more political philosophy and understanding more about neoliberalism is that it puts competition on, like, at its focus, right? And I think this whole competition paradigm, because it's not just in business, it's affecting us as individuals, right? Even in our social lives. So it got so pervasive that the paradigm of competition is now just everywhere. I think that's pretty destructive. Right, and we got to get away from this, and so I mean the question is like how are we going to deal with capitalism on one hand and with neoliberalism as a result of that on the other hand, right? Can we have a capitalism without neoliberalism, for example? Can we have a capitalism without the sickening paradigm of constant accumulation, which is forcing business to constantly make profit because otherwise they won't survive, right? So how about the two? And yeah, I haven't been thinking about this now actively, right, over the past years, but these are like the 2 major questions. Can we or should we save capitalism, and what to do with neoliberal deregulation, globalization, all that kind of stuff that came with it over the past 30, 40 years. Yeah.
So you said accumulation and competition. Then give us 2 things which are in the mindset or the worldview of managers in China within their political atmosphere.
Really managers in China, or from the perspective of Chinese philosophy?
Whatever you want to.
I would go with the philosophy, because I think you already explained that you're not too convinced of current Chinese capitalism, so to speak. So.
Well, but the worldview is not coming from the philosophy necessarily, but it's a political ideology. That's what I kind of wanted to tease out a little bit, if you are allowed to talk about that.
Oh yes, of course. Now I'm allowed to talk about it. I can just talk about anything. But yeah, I mean, in China, I think no one can imagine how it's like in China. Here it's already competitive. In China, it's ultra competitive, and people are psychologically suffering from this high level of competition everywhere. And it starts in school, right? Even at school, you're not free from that. It's extreme competition in school already. And so, yeah, I mean, in that regard, I find China even worse off than our societies, because I can see it with my students there when I still teach. They must be suffering. Like it's not like China for now is. I think it's very difficult to have a happy life in light of all this materialism, status claiming, and yeah. So yeah, so much about like this
third way any longer when it comes to worldview. So yeah, interesting.
Whereas I have to say, I mean, Antoinette, quoting your statistics, right? I think you suggested 74% of the people in the UK feel burnout from work. 80% of Germans feel stressed out at work.
Yeah, I know.
And we had the quote with Jeff Pfeffer suggesting that burnout is the 5th leading condition of death so burnout from work in the United States.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not sure whether situations can get much worse in some of the Western societies as well. So I think we're probably aligning ourselves to greater than needed suffering everywhere. But I want to ask my question then in the combining it with the final question. So if you take the Chinese or Eastern philosophy, the Aristotelian and neo-Aristotelian or the business ethics philosophy, kind of what are the 1, 2, 3 things that you really feel strongly, right? If you had the CEO of Amazon, right? Not even talking about rockets and so on, but you've got Jeff Bezos here with you now, and you got the unique chance to tell him, get your act together with these 1, 2, 3 things. What would you say they should learn from the philosophers that you know? And then the follow-up question, of course, is the grand question of today's series, which is, do we need more philosopher CEOs or not?
Yeah, I think like I personally would not be able to help Jeff Bezos, but just like as an as just a creative kind of exercise, I perhaps would think about like, okay, treat your employees in the right way and stop exploiting them, right? Make them feel they are part of the company and not just, ripping them off like in terms of, I don't know, a salary they can't live from. And then the second thing is stop short-term thinking and stop this ego. I mean, when you look at Amazon, it's pure ego. I mean, why does this guy wants to have wants to be on a rocket, like going to the moon? That's pure ego. He could have invested this amount of money, this vast amount of money in totally different ways, So perhaps my advice to Jeff Bezos is stop short-term thinking, try to take care finally about like your employees. And the third thing is don't waste money on things which are, I don't know, which don't have an impact here on society. You got to take care of society. I mean, man, you're so much saving from taxes, tax exemptions. You could potentially invest it somewhere in the communities, really. Like, but then
before you go to the moon. But then, sorry, you're going to mute there, Alicia. So the final question, and yes or no answer, more philosopher CEOs?
I wouldn't recommend philosophers for the position of CEOs, to be honest, because they lack the worldliness, We don't follow what we need are CEOs who can think in philosophical ways, And what I mean with this is they are good at critical thinking, they are good at changing perspectives, and they got perhaps some humanities education. So this is all what we could wish for, but please don't put a philosopher at the position of a CEO. I don't think it's going to work.
And with that, you've lost so many friends, Alicia, from this single 1.5 hour interview. But wonderful. Thank you for those answers. And we will check out with a rather facetious, fun 60 seconds interview, which will be the last thing on this call. So I will just fire questions on you, and I would ask you for a yes, no, neither, and a 1-sentence explanatory answer on each of those. And I will add one that wasn't on my schedule before, just based on what you just said, which is, would you, so the question is, Antoinette, help me, what is it, or general income, basic income, what is it called?
Basic income.
Basic income for everybody? Yes, no, neither?
Yeah, universal basic income, yes. Rather yes. Rather yes.
Rather yes. Okay. To learn more about the good life, I would rather have dinner with Martin Luther King, if he was still there, read the Tao Te Ching once more, or spend a year in a cloister.
I read the Tao Te Ching so often, and a cloister, I think I would choose Martin Luther King.
Yeah, that sounds very hedonistic in my mind. Good societies need which of the following? Good leaders, good rules, good virtues?
Good leaders.
Good leaders. I was hoping for the virtues answer. Very good. Aristotle or Confucius?
Neither.
You want to qualify that and lose a few more friends?
Yeah, that's just, I'm into Taoist philosophy, so that's not covered, unfortunately.
Taoist, okay. Capitalism or socialism?
Neither.
Any other answer?
Sorry, I have not framed my world vision yet.
So there needs to be something else. Germany or China?
Germany.
And if I could change the world doing one thing to make it a better place, it would be what?
Yeah, too bad. I actually had a note on that to be more prepared. I think if I could change something, it just came back. If I could change something, I would give people as much opportunity as possible to develop a hybrid mindset, because this is how we can integrate differences we see across the world, when we can develop a better understanding of how the world is in different places, So, yeah.
Wonderful. And with that, we're concluding the very first edition of our Leaders for Humanity series. It's been a wonderful pleasure, Alicia, to have you here. And Antoinette, it's always a wonderful pleasure to be with you. I hope people listening to us have enjoyed this rather wide-ranging exploration of philosophy all over the world. If you haven't listened to anything else, so the two pieces of advice that Alicia gives you to have a better life: one, be more prepared, that's what I heard. And secondly, indeed, try to get more worldviews, more hybridness in your thinking, in order to understand first what is actually going on with yourself and with the others. And I think that's a wonderful recommendation to close on. And with that, I would say, thank you very much for watching us. If you have any suggestions and thoughts, please come back to us and look at the website, and speak to you again soon.